These are the stories we share around the dinner table, tell in front of the campfire, and listen to on our porch. This is a place where tales are told and stories are heard. Grab your tea, your cocoa, your wild turkey whiskey, your wine. Welcome to Season 2 of the Storytellers Porch, where we will be hearing tales of the farm with your host and storyteller, Jill Davis.
Welcome to the Storytellers Porch. Today with me on the porch is Mark Wright. He is a husband, a dad, and he happens to be my dentist. He's a dentist for a lot of people, but he's also mine. And this is not a plug for his business, but I just have to let you know, he's the best dentist ever. And today I get to talk with him on the porch without him working on my teeth, which is even better. So Mark, welcome to the porch.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. This is going to be so much fun. For our audience, what happened was I was talking to Mark in the dentist seat about my podcast, and he started telling me about how he grew up. So he's joining me on the porch today. And Mark, I know you brought a drink with you today. What are you drinking on our porch today?
Black tea, courtesy of my wife.
That's a great one to have. I will tell you, I am drinking an energy drink because I have been hanging out at the farm, working very hard trying to put together this little 1930s farmhouse that has been in neglect. And so I am energy drinking. And that's actually why I invited you to the porch today, is because as we talked, we're both here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Neither of us are living on the farm. And this season's podcast is about farms. But as we talked, you let me know that you actually grew up not necessarily on a farm, but you did a lot of work on a ranch growing up. And so, Mark, tell me a little bit about where you were born and how you ended up ever being associated with a ranch.
Well, I kind of feel like an imposter for your program as far as being somebody who grew up on a ranch. But my grandfather did many jobs growing up. And when I was in junior high, his brother-in-law, my great uncle, bought a ranch outside of Olathe, Colorado. He was a contractor and he decided that raising sheep would be a really great idea economically. So my grandfather and I used to drive up every weekend for forever. And we reclaimed an old orchard, and I learned how to prune from my grandfather, and I learned how to dig and all that good stuff. So ultimately a house was placed on there, and then it became a sheep ranch and everything was added, tack house and all those different things.
When you say all those different things were added, let's talk about that a little bit, because growing up, my dad had the farm. Everybody who's listened to episode 1, I've talked about the farm. And there was a barn for the cows. And then there was what I thought he always said was a seed barn. It was actually a feed barn. So not an S, it was an F. Okay. And it wasn't until I went out there after I inherited that I realized a feed barn was where you put like the hay for the cows.
Okay.
So when you talk about a tack barn, I think is what you said. Yeah. Most of us don't know what that is. So tell me a little bit about the buildings that were placed there.
Okay. So my great uncle, his name was Joe. Joe built a house for my grandparents to live in. And my grandmother liked nicer things. And since it was his sister, he did a very nice job building her a house there. And then I call a tack shed is where you kept saddles and ropes and junk, anything that you didn't have a place for. My cousin, who was a year younger than me, he used to hang his beef jerky there. He just used to put strings and hang beef jerky to dry in there, but it held tools and tack. And then they built a barn that housed, like you said, hay and different things like that. Also in the winter time when a ewe was having issues, that's where they tried to direct them so that you'd be out of the weather while you were trying to deliver the babies. And they had a granary, I guess you'd call it that. It's the big metal building. We used to, and it was full of corn. And our favorite thing used to be to dig through and find baby mice that have nests in there.
Oh my gosh.
And then we would throw them out to the chickens, and the chickens would run around with them in their, things that 13, 14-year-old boys do.
What I love about that, Mark, is that that's what 13 to 14-year-old boys do, right? But I raised my boys in the city, and at 13 or 14, they were not doing that. They were doing other things. So the concept that you could go into the granary where there was corn, and for our listeners, a granary is like a silo. So it's a big round building. And the trend right now, if you didn't know this, Mark, is for younger couples to move those granaries to their property and turn them into houses.
That wouldn't shock me.
There's a big movement about granaries to houses, which I think is fascinating. But the fact that you could go in there, so like in the granaries, like there a door that you go in and then you can find the corn, or do you have like a little tunnel through the corn? What's that like?
No, it was a door. It was a normal sized door. Then we would just open it up and then we would just start digging. And then we knew eventually we would find something. And then I don't know how we learned that the chickens really like to eat mice, baby mice. There was also a chicken coop adjacent to that. I neglected to say that. I'm thinking back now. And we would have to clean up the coop. And it was always fun searching for eggs. And poop is poop. It doesn't matter, chicken or sheep or cow or pigs. They had pigs and we used to feed the slop to the pigs or dead chickens to the pigs, all those different things.
Oh, I remember the first time I ever saw a pig. So I grew up in the city and I was out on my uncle's farm in Washington State. And they had those big hogs, which are scary, right? Then they had baby pigs. And I was so excited about these little baby pigs because they were so cute. And then the baby pig ran over and ate a baby chicken. And I was like, oh, maybe I don't like farm life after all.
I know. Well, everybody thinks that they all live in harmony like Charlotte's Web. It doesn't happen that way. Certain animals will eat each other easily.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Wilbur was not everybody's friendly pig, right? Oh, so how did you're not that old. Some of the people we've interviewed are in their 80s and remembering a long, long time ago. You're not that old. How in the world did your grandparents convince you and your cousin, right?
Right.
To go out there and shovel poop? I was going to use another word, but we're going to use the word poop.
Right.
Wow.
I'm 57. I have 2 grandsons that are 11 and 9. One of them will readily do anything because he just likes hanging with me, I think. Mm-hmm. The other one, if it involves effort, does not. And my cousin and I, it was just always, we liked being with our grandparents. We loved them dearly. We didn't have computers and TVs and things like that. So we would get up, we would work. And then after lunch, we would do whatever was necessary, but then we would go hunting. And we would hunt in the afternoon till it got dark. And then we would come back and do whatever my grandfather needed. And that was our entertainment. And I just liked being with my grandfather.
Did you go during the weekends on the school year? And then did you stay out there during the summer or?
No, in the summer, I worked in Grand Junction, but my grandparents originally were in Clifton, near where I grew up. And I was an only child. And I think my mother oftentimes had just had enough of me. And my grandmother doted on me. And so I just grew up staying with them a lot. So when they moved to Olathe, it was more problematic because getting there was a little bit of a chore. It's an hour drive. So my mom would drive me there and leave me. And for the weekends or like Christmas break, I would spend a lot of Christmas holiday there or anytime we could. And then as soon as I was 16 and I could drive, then I just drove myself down whenever I wanted because they were like my second parents.
But it's interesting what you said about your mom would get tired, so she would send you to your grandmother's. And isn't that the joy of being a grandparent is we don't have to discipline them. We just get to play with them. That's my favorite part.
Oh, no, they disciplined me.
They
trust
did.
me. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And as I had another set of cousins, as they got older, they would be down too. And, basically the joy that we had was hurting each other, doing things to each other. And so there was a lot of bawling out going on all the time in their way. They weren't like my parents, but you knew when you had done something wrong and you never wanted to disappoint them.
That's the key, right? We don't want to disappoint. I'm a little envious because all of my grandparents had passed before I was even born. So I didn't get to know grandparents. So I think that that's a fabulous thing that you got to do that. Let's talk a little bit about what you gave me, like the idea of what a basic day was. Like you'd get up, you'd do the chores, you do what needed to be done, you'd have lunch, you do a little bit more, and then you go hunting. Let's start in the morning, because for most people, like you and I talked, most people have a little fantasy concept of what a farm is, right? Like the pictures of the farm style houses and everything. And that's not really what it's like. It's kind of a dirty, messy business. So when you woke up in the morning, did your grandma fix you breakfast? What did you do first when you first got up?
Well, my grandmother always had a huge breakfast, and I'm half Mexican. So oftentimes there were things like beans or tortillas. She would make homemade tortillas, which I have never found anybody who could match hers. But she would fix us a big meal. And I was under the assumption back then, mistakenly, that that was her greatest joy in life, was to basically get up, cook all day, clean all day, and get up and do it again the next day, just because we were so amazing that she would love to do that. And as you get older, you realize, because as soon as breakfast was done, she was transitioning to lunch.
Right.
And then as soon as lunch is done, she was transitioning to, and we always had meat. Every meal was meat. And so she was doing that and taking stuff out to thaw and do all that. So we would have a big breakfast. Usually the time of the year that I was there the most was when it was cold. Back then, my family didn't have weather resistant things. We had blue jeans and the white long underwear and rubber boots, and you just got all that on and you went out and you started. And since it was a sheep centric ranch, the first thing was water. You had to make sure everything was watered, and you had to break through the ice if there wasn't. So you do that. And then you baled hay and you'd put it on the back of an old flatbed truck. And that was the other reason it was fun to go, because when you're 12 or 13, you get to drive.
That's
And
right.
my mother always used to let me drive, though. So I don't know why that was a big deal, but we just had that freedom. My grandfather just told us to do it, and there was no teaching us how to drive a stick or anything. We just had to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd go and you'd feed them, and then you clean up a bit. And that was always kind of the issue with me, because my grandfather was like, just throw the twine for the bales of hay and things. Just throw it over there. And my grandmother did not like that. So it was kind of trying to keep him happy and her happy on keeping things neat and clean. And because farming there's other things. Most men that I've been around in the farm, they're not worried about if there's a pile of wire or a pile of string or anything like that. And my grandmother was very meticulous about that stuff. So,
Mark, that's really funny that you talk about that. And I want to go back to your grandmother here in just a moment. But when I inherited my farm and I went out there, and there were just like piles of junk everywhere. And it just really honestly upset me a lot. And being the fact that it's way out in the country, you can't like get a trash bin to put all of it in and have somebody haul it off. One of my farmer friends came and dug me a hole, and I put all the trash in there, and I could just see him shaking his head at me. And now I realize why. It's because most farmers don't care.
No, I mean, they have a lot of land, and if you can't burn it, it's like, well, I'm not really that concerned. My grandmother wanted things neat and clean, and that's who she was.
That's how I am. I relate to your grandmother. So as you were growing up and your grandma was cooking the meals and she was doing all of that, this would have been like the 70s, right?
I'd say 76 to 82.
So by 76, my mother, we were in the city. She didn't get her first dishwasher until mid 70s. Did your grandmother have all the niceties that we think of now in a kitchen, like a dishwasher and a nice oven and all the freezer stuff?
Not at all. Well, they had a freezer. When my uncle built this house, he was practical. It was a 2-story house into a hillside, and he built mirrored. So there was a kitchen downstairs and stuff. So if 2 families wanted to come in there at some point, they could. But no, my grandmother, she didn't have a dishwasher. I'm trying to think even if she had a garbage disposal. The only other thing I remember is just her constantly being upset at my grandfather because they had linoleum, and she was constantly sweeping the linoleum of mud. And she just would ask him to take his boots off at the door, and he would forget. Truthfully, he didn't care. If he cared, he would have done it. As you get older, you realize these things before you're just oblivious to it.
It's amazing to me as I hear that, because I don't want to be gender biased here at all, but I know that I always heard the stories of my grandmother fighting the dust in the house in Kansas, and nobody cared but my grandmother. So it may be a little bit of the heritage, I'm not sure, but of just wanting that tidiness. So if your grandfather wasn't as concerned, then you got to go hang out with him and be a little less concerned about the wire bales, but trying to please your grandma at the same time. That must have been an adventure.
I never really saw them argue with each other over, to me, important things. I just remember one Christmas, my grandmother wanted a goose for Christmas.
Oh.
We had geese there. And so, of course, my cousin and I were more than excited to slaughter this goose. Once we killed the goose and we started plucking it, we realized that that was not fun at all. It's a ton of work. So then we went to my grandfather, of course, and said, can't we just skin it? And he's like, Sure. And my grandmother came out at the same time and she's like, no, you're plucking it. And then they got into this fight. And then you realize that's one of those moments you realize that harvesting animals, whether it's wild game or farm animals, it is just a ton of work. And we were so excited because we hated the geese on the farm. So we were like, if we could get rid of them, we were more than happy.
I don't know about your kids because you raised your children in the city, right?
Right.
My kids, I can still remember my daughter when she was probably 10 or 11, when she realized that the chicken nuggets she ate came from an actual animal and how horrified she was. And it's a whole different world when you actually have to, in my opinion, you're on the land looking at the food you're growing. I think it gives you a little bit different perspective. And then, so you did the chores. I love the fact that I'd forgotten about spreading hay in front of the animals off the flatbed trucks. Mm-hmm. That's really fun. And you were talking about getting to drive early. My mother had a fit because my dad taught us all how to drive at 10, but we lived in Colorado Springs. And she would have a fit. And he's like, well, I was 7 when I learned to drive. 10 is way too old.
Exactly.
So, there's a farmer concept that is so different than other places. And that's really what we're trying to express in this series of podcasts. So after you fed the sheep or whatever you had to feed, the geese, the chicken, give them a few mice, all of that, then what happened? You went back in the house and ate more food that your grandmother had fixed.
Yeah, we would do whatever my grandfather would ask, and then would go in and would have this amazing lunch. And never once did it occur to me then to say, can we wash the dishes? Because there wasn't a dishwasher. Again, I just assumed that my grandmother just thought that I was so amazing that slaving away every day for me was something that just was her desire. As you get older, and she's gone now, I really would have liked to have asked her. I have such amazing memories of that. But was there anything else you ever wanted to do with your life? When you're younger, you don't think of those things to have those conversations.
Do you also think, because I've thought about that about my mother, what else did she want to do when she was young, and her mother? And I believe that this is just my belief. I'd love for listeners to give us other ideas. But in that generation, it was also about division of labor and survival. We didn't have as many options. I can not do dishes and just buy paper plates if I wanted to, right?
Right.
They didn't have those options. So division of labor was so different and so necessary. You needed 2 people to run a farm or a ranch or anything, one to take care of the nurturing part and one to take care of the physical part. And it was just the natural division of labor. But it definitely has changed. And I do wonder what the women of that time thought. Yeah. And the artists, the men who were born as artists or musicians or whatever into farm families and were still expected to do the work rather than pursue their dreams. Very different lifestyle. And I think that for a child, a lot of fun. For an adult, who knows, right?
Yes. Well, it's work. I mean, it's just simple. It's just, like you said, most days are just, I don't want to say drudgery, but you just have a routine that has to be accomplished. Because if you don't, all these animals of yours or your crops or whatever it is will perish. That's a huge responsibility.
It really is. So when you were done with lunch and your grandmother was now washing the dishes again and getting ready for the next meal, you and your cousins, did you have a little bit more work to do, or did you get to go hunting and play at that time? Because that was a form of play.
We'd just ask my grandfather, do you need anything? And he'd say, no. So then we would just grab our guns, and my uncle's property went to a bluff and then went down, and then there was a river below it. So then we would just go down and play down there. We would just hunt. And whether things were in season or whether they weren't, we just hunted. It was just a great way to get away. Those were really fun days in my life.
I'm thinking about this because I started hunting when I was in my early 40s, and I had to take a hunter safety course before I could go hunting. Did you have to take a hunter safety course?
Yes, I still have my card, as a matter of fact. And so as soon as my kids were old enough, they were in hunter safety course immediately. I'm glad. The lessons I learned there, it drives me crazy when my grandchildren have the Nerf guns and they're pointing them at each other, and they just don't grasp the concept that these can still hurt people. I
remember the first time I got a bird, my first ever, because I only hunted birds. And I remember the first time I ever saw a bird die was the person I was hunting with. He shot a pheasant. And I realized in that moment how powerful those weapons are. One of the things you talked about was delivering baby sheep, lambs.
So it's lambing season. Yeah, when they come. I also learned that sheep are not the brightest animals in the world. And everybody thinks they're beautiful and lovely, but they're not soft. They're rough. If you just get next to a sheep, it's rough. And every animal is money. Every animal that you can keep alive, either from birth or doing something silly and killing themselves, falling into something or doing something, is important. It was very cool to be a teenager and you was having issues and you'd get to stick your arm in there and sort around and feel the little legs and try to figure out, and you feel the pressure that that animal's exerting on your arm as you're doing it. It was very, very special. When you'd be out there, if you couldn't get your shirt out of the way, you'd take your shirt off and it's snowing and it's cold. And then you'd get them and they arrive dead. And sometimes you'd try to resuscitate them and this little animal. And it's also heartbreaking at times too, because, they're just young little lives that you couldn't help.
It definitely creates a respect for life though, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. Life and death at a very, very young age. And I love all of the concepts of what you learned out there. And when I think about the difference of being raised on a farm and not being raised on a farm, or being raised in that environment, I remember my dad talking about this. It's the work ethic that comes from being a farm kid or working in that environment, because it really is sometimes life or death. And like you're talking, if you don't get out there and deliver that baby, it may not live. There are life and death situations that city kids may have to learn in different ways. I just wish that everybody, and this is me being very sentimental, but everybody would have had an opportunity to do that. I did not get that opportunity because my dad was a city boy by the time I was born, and I was born in the city where I belong. I do not belong on a farm, but there's so many life lessons in there from growing up on a ranch and growing up on a farm. And so even though our podcast is really just about stories, we always have life lessons that we've learned from him. So I'm curious, Mark, as you look back at that time, and we can become very reminiscent and nostalgic of that time because it's a great time in life. How would you say that time in life impacted who you are in the here and now?
Well, one, spending time with my grandparents. I just was very fortunate to be very, very close to them. I don't know if that is part of the Mexican influence, because they were very different with me than my paternal grandmother was. She had a job. We would spend time together and we would go to my family cabin and things like that. Where you really learn about people and love is just, like you said, working, sitting down, eating at a table, just doing basic things and helping each other. And I can remember going and helping my grandmother bring the laundry off the line, all those things. And so my work ethic, I think, was also fostered by that. On Sundays, my grandfather and I drove 60 miles to go and work at this empty orchard. And we would just work all day and stop and have lunch and talk, and then back up in the trees and doing it. And both my grandparents were hard workers. And to me, that was what was normal. They did it. And I just knew that's what I had to do. And I also knew that I didn't want to be a laborer, and not that there's anything wrong with it. I just knew that it was hard work. And sometimes you didn't get payment that's reflective of that hard work.
Yeah, the financial reward is not always reflective of the hours spent. So this is a very deep question that I haven't prepared you for, but as I'm listening to you, every time I walk into your office, there's a sense of community there. Everybody's talking to each other. It has a good feel to it of community. Do you think that came from growing up with your grandparents creating community for you and your cousins?
Absolutely. And the other thing was, kind of reflecting back, my paternal grandmother, I never knew my paternal grandfather. He died before I was born. But if I went to her house, we would have to call and make kind of a reservation that we were going to come visit. And we would sit in the living room, and it was very formal. As a child, I used to dread that. And if I was hungry, I would never ask my grandma Wright, can I get something to eat? Never.
Uh-huh.
And my grandmother, the house was mine. I could go into the fridge and get whatever I wanted. If I brought friends, they were welcome. You ate. If somebody came by the farm and it was a mealtime, it wasn't an option. They were staying to eat. Right. And my grandfather used to bring in migrant workers periodically. And I can always remember one day in the spring, we would go get in a truck, we would pick up all these men of various ages, and my grandfather would come, and in one day they would plant petunias, they'd do the yard, everything that my grandmother wanted, they would knock out in one day.
Wow.
And my grandmother would put this huge feast on for them. And my grandfather would say, they have their lunch. What are you doing? They're workers here. I'm just bringing them in. And she's like, no, if they're here, they're our guests and we feed them and we do everything. And she was always that way. And didn't matter. If you came late, she would ask, have you eaten? I guess food was her love language or her way of doing it. And so to me, when somebody walks in my practice, they're in my house. And to me, I want them to be at home. And if it means them leaving with beer or them
or wine
or wine or whatever they need, and it's the same thing with my staff. They're my family. I'm an only child. So I didn't have a lot of people around me. So I value those times when we would get together.
I think there's so much to learn from not just the farm life, but the farm way of life. And I would love, and I hope as I'm learning more and more about farms and how farms exist, and our whole series of this podcast is all about farm life because it's becoming a thing of the past. As you talk about your grandfather working on your great uncle's farm, it was a self-contained entity. Anymore, most farmers they run their own land, but it's for a corporate organization. My goal, and listeners, if you have ideas, please send them in. My goal is to bring in the way that farm life impacts us into other places in our world. So you just gave me confidence because my grandkids walk in the house and the first thing they do is go to the pantry and look on the grandkids' snack shelf. They know that if they're in grandma's house, they can have anything on the snack shelf. So continue to incorporate those ideas and those feelings into our current lives. I think will make our world and our communities a better place.
Well, you just triggered something for me because dentistry is the same way as farming now. You're talking about corporations coming in and buying up farms. Well, it's the same thing. I'm a dinosaur. Having a solo practice is going by the wayside because of the effort that it's just like if you own your own farm, if you need a tractor, you have to pay for the tractor.
And insurance and the repairs.
Exactly. You bear that whole financial load. Whereas if you're in dentistry, it's a dental service organization. There's lots of them out there that are large conglomerates. They have money from private equity and they come in and just buy things and they're good at business. And what they do is they can buy in bulk. They can do all those things. And you're just an employee. When you said that, it really triggered for me because it is a struggle to maintain that way of doing business, whether it's a solo farmer or a solo dentist.
This is not where I thought we were going to go, but we're going to go there a little bit.
Okay.
And that's the thing is that when we do it individually, I believe that there is more heart in it. And I'm not dissing the corporate dentist too much, just a little bit. But I know when I came to you the first time, I had lost a crown. I had a lot of pain. I'd had a bad experience. And a friend recommended you. So I came to see you and you took care of it. It was easy. It didn't hurt very much. And it was comfortable. My son had a similar experience, but he goes to a corporate dentist because of his insurance. He has a lot of dental problems. They would not see him for 2 days because there was no space for him. It's a whole different way of life. So I think the next place I'm going to have to explore on all of this is how do we return back to, and I watch my children's generation, which is, the 20s and 30s, going back to smaller things. My daughter won't buy anything from corporate companies, buys everything from local creators. I think if we can bring it back that way, maybe we can bring back the small farms. Maybe we can keep the private dentist. So listeners, tell us how you are supporting the smaller businesses, those who are not run by corporate, so that we continue to have that community that we need in our world. And that, Mark, is not where I plan to go today, but I think that's where we're going to wind it up because it's a powerful concept.
No, it is. And the other thing is your daughter, she's committed to that. And it's not easy or convenient. And two, it's more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy to get on your computer, 3 buttons, and a day later, it's at your doorstep. It requires effort to drive down to a local shop and actually get in the store, wander, shop, and come home. That requires effort. It's what was normal for us when we were young. That was the way that things were done. But it really requires a commitment. And sometimes, in all fairness, sometimes we're up for that and sometimes we're not.
And when you think about it, it required a commitment of your grandfather to drive out to the orchard every Sunday and work on it. It required a commitment from your great uncle to make a house for his sister so they could do that. I believe that part of it is over time, we have forgotten about time. And I talk about this in one of the other episodes. I have really learned about time, Mark, by living out on my farm. Because if you're driving down one road, it's mountain time. You turn the corner and it's central time. You turn right, it's central time. When you leave the farm, you turn left and it's mountain time. And so time becomes of zero importance because I'm never on time no matter where I go because of this hour change. That would be another piece is, can we slow down enough to be conscious about who we choose to spend our money with, where we choose to purchase our food, and where we go to get our teeth taken care of. I think that's part of it, is slowing down enough to make sure that happens.
Well, busyness is our enemy sometimes.
Yes,
it
absolutely.
Really is.
That is the farm lesson we're going to take away today, is that busyness is our enemy. Let's slow down. I'm going to challenge my audience just one time this week or in the next 2 weeks, make the choice to go to a small bookstore or to go to a smaller grocery store. Go someplace where it is not corporate owned and see how it feels on you. I just challenge you to do that. Mark, I know you and I could talk forever, but I bet you have a few patients waiting on you. I want to just make sure that you have shared everything you want to before we close out our time here on the porch today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure for me to reminisce about something that's dear to my heart. And I miss my grandparents, I think, as most of us do.
I believe that names are so important. Names keep us alive. Our memories keep them alive. Would you like to give me the names of your grandparents and share them?
Sure. My grandfather was Nelson Martinez, and my grandmother was Julia Martinez. And my daughter's named after my grandmother.
I was just going to say, I recognize that name. In honor of your grandparents and in honor of you being here, I want to say thank you so much. I appreciate you being here.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Here at the Storytellers Porch, we believe we are the stories we share. Keep living your story and meet us next time here on the porch. And be sure to bring your favorite drink.
To learn more about this season's storytellers and to catch past episodes of the Storytellers Porch, visit us at thestorytellersporch.com. To make sure you hear every exciting episode with Jill this season, subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you hear your favorite shows. We'll see you next time here on the porch at the farm, where I'll be drinking iced coffee and occasionally some wild turkey whiskey. What drink will you bring?